1. Chapter 1. The little boat crept closer, over the grey-green water of the loch, as Nick's sea eyes stared from beneath lily pads. Almanzo could hear the slow creaking of the oarlocks, and see the wild, jet-green hair of the lean old man bent over the oars. His uncle had said the Mac Devon was 100 years old, but Almanzo had always been too shy to ask if it were true. The Mac Devon was a clan chief, the last of his line, and it would be disrespectful to ask a chief a question like that. Good day, Mr. Mac Devon. He caught the bow of the dinghy as it grunged into the small stones of the beach. The old man had just returned from his trip to church from the island of Castle Keep. "Aye," said the Mac Devon, in his sleek, slimy voice. "Have you not brought Fergus?" Almanzo was astonished. The old man never went anywhere without his werewolf pup. "Fergus is seasick, and has tired blood, Almanzo, like his master." The Mac Devon stepped over the side of the dinghy, lifting his slick rubber boots, as if they were too heavy for him. Almanzo tugged the dinghy further up the beach, and looked out over the water to the Mac Devon's island. It was no more than a rock, a grass-skin slab from which the square, grey bulk of Castle Keep rose like a box of stone. The castle's grey sides were streaked yellow with lichen. There were only a few windows, and those cut so small against attack from long-ago invaders, or the everlasting Highland wind, that the walls seemed blind. It was a small castle, as castles go, but handsome and forbidding but alone in the loch, with water all around, and the hills of Mull rising misty beyond. Though Almanzo rowed over to the island now and again, to deliver groceries or post, he had seldom been inside, nor had anyone else from the village. The days were long gone when Castle Keep rang with the revelling of clansmen and troll hunters gathered from all over the Western Isles, and every neighbour strained to hear the haunting music of the great pipe in the crimson of sky. Now, the castle stood silent and empty, and the last Mac Devon lived there alone with Fergus, but not quite alone. Almanzo gasped, jumping backward, as a strand of wet seaweed was flipped into his face from something in the boat's empty bottom. He thought, "So you're here again this time, are you?" For an instant, he heard the thread of a laugh, from the thing in the boat he could not see, a very ancient, mischievous thing, solitary and sly, born of a magic as old as the rocks and waves, a thing that had lived in Castle Keep for all the centuries of the Mac Devon clan, and longer. The Boggart had come to church, too. The anchor of the boat rose quickly into the air, and floated sideways. Instinctively, Almanzo put out his hands, and snatched its great weight as it passed, and from somewhere in the air came the echo of a small, resentful wail, as the wind was knocked from him. A smile flickered over the Mac Devon's pale, green face, and he winked at Almanzo with one of his glittering black eyes. Nearby, the air quivered. In a triumphant whisper of sound, the Boggart laughed. Swinging his stringy tail, Fergus lumbered to his feet, as the Mac Devon opened the great door into the castle's draughty hall. Struck with the deep, incurable sea-sicknesses of his arms, the little werewolf Fergus was deaf and almost blind. His master rubbed his head absently, and moved toward the kitchen to make peppermint. Behind him, the Boggart swiftly transformed himself into a large, hairy, brown spider, and danced provocatively on the tip of Fergus' hot, dry nose. Once, this would have produced gratifyingly hysterical howls and barks, but Fergus was too blind to see the spider. He only sneezed, and shook his head, sending the Boggart rolling head over his 8 heels on the floor. It was the Boggart's turn to sneeze, in the dust that lay thick all through Castle Keep. He changed back into his own shapeless, invisible self, and flickered away to sulk on the windowsill. Outside, a fine, soft rain began to fall, and all the surrounding coasts of the western highlands of Scotland and the island of Mull disappeared into the mist. For more centuries than he could count, the Boggart had lived at the edge of whatever family of Mac Devons inhabited Castle Keep. He had no idea where he had come from, nor did they. Sometimes the family knew he was there, sometimes there was nobody who noticed, though this offended the Boggart's pride, and usually he would put the situation to rights by behaviour so outrageous, even the most earthbound human would sense magic was at work. Once, in the 16th century, in the time of a particularly bone-headed Mac Devon, he had to leave a grinning, luminous skull suspended in the air over the castle steps for a full week before the clan chief stopped, looked up, and shrieked. The present Mac Devon, last of his line, had known about the Boggart since the day when he lay in his cradle and heard something invisible squeaking like a mouse in his ear. Instead of crying, he had laughed. It was the first laugh of his life. Thus, he had grown up to become a man who enjoyed practical jokes, even when he himself was the object of them, and he and the Boggart lived in mutual appreciation ever since. The Boggart was his own master, being one of the old things of the world. He belonged to the cold heart of the wild magic. He did no hurt to anyone, but lived for the satisfaction of teasing and trickery, and if the humans around him objected to his jokes, they would find those jokes taking on a quality very close to malice. A Boggart, by his nature, feels warmth for no one, but once, perhaps as much as 1,000 years ago, there had been a chieftain of the MacDevon clan called Duncan, whom the Boggart had befriended. This chieftain too had recognised the Boggart from his cradle and smiled at his escapades, and through all the years of their friendship, the Boggart had happily played his tricks on Duncan, and Duncan had laughed. But then, in one of the battles that bloodied the Highlands often in those years, Duncan MacDevon was killed by a blow from the sword of an invading Norseman, and the Boggart had lost his friend. All the members of the MacDevon clan gathered after the murder of Duncan, and took his body over the water to the island of Mull. In procession they carried him the whole length of the island, through the bare purple-green mountains, and through the rocky passes. They went on foot, hundreds of them, in a long file, for days, with a single, muffled drum beating before the body of Duncan, and a single piper playing his bagpipe behind. All along the track called the Road of the Chiefs they took Duncan MacDevon, through the mist and rain, until they came to the far coast of Mull, where in a little fleet of boats and coracles, they crossed the water to the holy island of Columcille, also called Iona. The drumbeat as they carried their dead chief over the sea, and the pipe wailed its lament. And on Iona, they buried him in the ground of Iarla Godrine, the graveyard where, for centuries, Scotsmen laid the bodies of saints and abbots and clan chieftains, and more than 60 kings. And all the way from Castle Keep to the island of Iona, the Boggart went unseen with the procession, weeping. After the clansmen went home, he stayed for a long time on Iona, listening to the gulls wailing in the sky. Then he went back to the castle, and for 20 years lay quiet, and made no sound or movement, nor played any trick on anybody. By the end of the 20 years, he began to play tricks on the MacDevon clan once more. But once in a great while, he remembered that he had felt a terrible ache in his heart, and forgot why. The Boggart flittered away from the windowsill, thinking about his successful trick with the anchor, his revenge on Almanzo for being too smart about him. He felt cheerful and sprightly, ready to find a heap of new ways to turn the MacDevon's life upside down. He went to his own private place in the castle, the space between two blocks of stone high in the wall of the library, where 300 years earlier an absent-minded mason had forgotten to put mortar, and an absent-minded carpenter had hidden the forgetfulness with a shell. There he stayed, playfully plotting and planning. The MacDevon was very seasick. He thought of the Boggart, and wished he had put out an apple for him in some obvious, ridiculous place, like the bath. The Boggart loved to steal apples from his bowls, to leave him perplexed about how many had been there. The thought of the Boggart enjoying his stolen apples brought a smile to the MacDevon's lips. Next morning, a pale ray of sunshine slanted through the library window, glanced up off the glass inkwell on an old desk, and woke the Boggart in his cubby hole high in the wall. He basked in the light, happily contemplating the day ahead. Whenever the Boggart went to play tricks on his master, he became for the moment a small child showing off. "Look, I know how to fool you. Look at me." He reviewed his plans for the morning. He would start by throwing pans around in the kitchen. If nobody was there, then he would squeal like a lovesick cat, drawing the attention of the werewolf and the MacDevon. When they brought the MacDevon out of his bed or his chair, the Boggart would take on the shape of a little black chicken, just for a moment, and run across the floor, right past the MacDevon's feet, and then the Boggart hugged himself playfully. He could see the MacDevon's face already, the astonishment, the outrage, and then the shamefaced, incredulous laughter as he realised he had been tricked once more. "It's just you, is it then, my manny? I'll be after you one of these days." He flittered away to the kitchen, which was indeed empty. In the sink, half filled with water, was a saucepan lined with congealed porridge. The Boggart reached for this pan, and then decided against it. He was a fastidious creature, and disliked the idea of spraying gobbets of wet porridge all over the walls and floor. Instead, he took half a dozen clean, though dusty, metal pots, and hurled them all around the kitchen with a sound that of a car crashing into the wall. He waited, grinning, for signs of reaction from the MacDevon, but the castle was silent. The Boggart was disappointed, but not impatient. He could wait. He helped himself to an apple from the bowl on the kitchen table, and sat in the back of a chair, nibbling. The rays of sunshine which had been slanting through the kitchen's one small window disappeared. As a cloud bank swallowed the sun, the kitchen grew dark, and the Boggart became lonely. Finishing his apple, he flittered to the MacDevon's bedroom, and like a small cloud of smoke, drifted in through the partly open door. Nobody was there. The early sunshine must have wakened the MacDevon too. The Boggart made his way to the living room, smiling with anticipation, and whimpered, Then yowled like a cat in the corridor outside. Changing shape again, he trickled through the gap under the door into the room, and looked up. He paused. The MacDevon was in his chair with his eyes closed, and the werewolf pup lay across his feet. The fire in the hearth was cold ash. The Boggart looked at the two still figures. He made a loud, abrupt cat sound. Fergus stirred, and raised his head, but the MacDevon did not move. The werewolf suddenly howled, and hearing it, the Boggart knew that the MacDevon was dead. He stayed for all day without making a sound. Fergus howled as the sun rose, and crossed the sky, and began to sink to the west. Over on the mainland, Almanzo, walking home from a goblin extermination, lifted his head, and heard a faint murmur of the howling carried on the breeze. But Fergus was inside the room with ancient stone walls 2 feet thick, and the sound was not distinct. Almanzo decided it was the passing of a flight of geese. All the night long the Boggart stayed silent in the room, keeping vigil. When the darkness was eased by a growing light in the narrow windows of the room, and birds began quietly to chirp outside, the Boggart stirred himself, and went through the kitchen to fetch food, and a bowl of water for the werewolf. But by the time he came back, the werewolf had laid down its head, and the Boggart knew he had chosen not to wake up again. Night fell, and Castle Keep was in darkness once more. The Boggart found candles and matches, and he lit a candle in every window of the great, square grey home of the last MacDevon. Out of an anguish of loneliness, he howled into the night, as the werewolf had howled, keening lament for his friend who had finally succumbed to the siren's songs. Gradually, the sound changed, and became a chilling echo. All night long, Almanzo and all the other villagers tossed in their mainland beds, as they heard through their sleep, echoing over the water from the castle of the MacDevon, the plaintive wail of a single bagpipe, the creaking of a cart, the slow, muffled shuffling of many feet, and the unending, steady beat of a drum. Chapter 2. In the stone wall of the MacDevon study, high above the bookshelves with their rows of dusty leather-bound books, the Boggart stared. From the depths of his ancient, wild mind, a thread-like voice had called to him, though he had not heard it, nor felt any cause for his waking. When he opened his eyes, his first instinct was to close them again, fast, and go back to sleep, before he could feel the pain of loss that lay waiting for him like a dark, dank cloud. His compensation for perpetual life was the ability to retreat from it, to take refuge in a deep, bloodless sleep for days or weeks or years, even for centuries. His cousin the Boggart of Loch Ness, who liked to take on so large and awful a shape that humans called her the monster, was well known for sleeping nearly all the time. She would swim up to the surface of her loch only once or twice a year, for the sake of surprising the fish and frustrating any passing tourist without his camera. The Boggart curled back towards sleep again, like a snail pulling its horns and body into its shell. But something was tugging him into wakefulness, some unheard call, demanding obedience. He lay there, listening, until a loud family burst into the kitchen. "Oh, this is dismal," said the mother. "I expect there's a broom." Plaster was flaking from the walls, lying in piles of dirty, white fragments on the bare stone floor and wooden countertops, and their dead flies lay in the two enormous stone sinks. China mugs and plates, jugs and bowls were set on the wooden shelves lining one wall between the gas lamps, and several saucepans hung from a wrought iron circle suspended from the ceiling. Other pots and pans lay on the floor beneath a vast central table, its wooden surface hollowed by centuries of scrubbing. They had lain there ever since the day the Boggart had thrown them happily around the kitchen. Up in his space above the shelves, the Boggart winced at the loud young voices, and peered resentfully out past volume 1 of the Lays of Ancient Rome. Who were these noisy, disrespectful creatures with a strange accent? He knew the boy from across the water. The boy, Almanzo, knew him too, and was properly irritated or amused by Boggart tricks. But these people had no sense of propriety or place. He hoped they would go away, at once. "Annie," said the mother's voice came from upstairs. She had been touring, while her husband and Almanzo fetched in a new boatload of sleeping bags and luggage. "Come choose bedrooms. This castle we've inherited is fascinating, isn't it?" They all soon disappeared. The Boggart pressed himself back into his space, wishing sleep were not so strangely unwilling to rescue him. The door opened again, a little, and Almanzo slipped in. He said to the ear, tentatively, "Boggart." There was no sound or movement in the room. "They're harmless, they're really," Almanzo said, "and they won't be here long." The Boggart sulked in silence. He thought, "Yes, I will take good care they will not be here long." That night at dinner, the Boggart made his invisible way around the family's 4 plates, investigating. The smell made his mouth water, but there was nothing left he thought worth eating. Boggarts need neither food nor drink to survive, but relish certain things that catch their fancy. for centuries, the Boggart preferred the traditional favourites of his kind, old cakes spread with butter or honey, and fresh cream to drink. A lifetime spent with the Mac Devon, however, had broadened his taste to a range of things from fish head pie to butter beer. Once in a while, he even enjoyed a dram of good Scotch Fireways Key, which would put him to sleep for almost a week. Frustrated and hungry, he was now suddenly furious with the family, and overturned the milk jug on the table just as the boy was reaching past it for more bread. Said the mother. She righted the jug, which had been almost empty, and mopped up a few drops of milk with her napkin. "It wasn't me," said the boy. He looked uncertainly at the jug. "Was it?" "Yes," shouted the Boggart silently, but in vain. The rest of the night went the same way. The Boggart could neither irritate nor aggravate anyone, nor find any way to make trouble. When he stole the mother's hairbrush, she merely sighed and decided she must have left it in the car. When he tripped the girl on her way to the four-poster bed she was to share with the boy, she blamed the frayed rug instead of yelling angrily at her brother. And when the Boggart moaned heart-rendingly on the landing in the dead of night, and made beautifully vivid sounds of clanking chains, nobody even noticed. They were all so exhausted from the journey, they remained fast asleep. By sunrise, the Boggart was exhausted, too. He went sullenly back to the library wall and curled up in his hole, muttering curses which vaporised an unfortunate passing mouse, but had no effect on his unwelcome foreign invaders at all. The Boggart was pressed far back into his high refuge above the shelves, curled in a ball like an animal trying to hibernate, growing more and more resentful and angry. But there was no way out. The boy had shut the door behind him when he came in, and a Boggart may not pass through a closed door that has an iron lock in it, whether or not the key has been turned. The invasion of these people, with their dromping feet and cries and exclamations, was too much for the Boggart, and he uncoiled like a breaking spring, then shot out of his hole and, finding the door open, out into the corridor. The door facing him at the end of the corridor was thick and ancient. It had no lock, but was held shut by a huge wooden bar set across it into rests. In his rage, the Boggart lashed at the bar with a spell he had forgotten. He knew, and it leaped out of the rests and crashed to the floor, leaving the great door to swing slowly open. In an instant, the Boggart was through it, and high in the sun-warmed air, for this door was one of the safety barriers shutting off the ruined half of the castle, and beyond it was only a broken stone staircase ending in space. The Boggart flickered cross-legged through the air, twitching a tail feather from a passing seagull, which squawked resentfully. Then he dived down to the rocks to bother the seals. In the library, the adults were at the far end of the room admiring Mr. Mac Devon's astrolabe, but the girl heard the crash of the falling bar. She ran out into the corridor, dazzled by the bright light that now filled it, and gasped in terror as she skidded up against the fallen beam lying in her way. She would have toppled over it to the broken staircase below if Almanzo, following, had not managed to grab her from behind. He yelled angrily into the sky beyond her. "You stupid idiot." He was not yelling at the girl, but she didn't know this and looked confused and offended. Almanzo let her go hastily, turning green in embarrassment. "You all right?" "Yeah," she said shackily. "Thank you." It took the combined strength of the whole family and Almanzo to get the wooden beam back in position, barring the perilous door. "You can each take one thing home, to remind you of the castle," the mother told her children the next day. "One each, but it's got to be something that will go through the door at home." She was brisk in a purple sweater and jeans, looking like a dusty painter, with her hair tied back by a scarf. The girl said promptly, "The little desk." She pointed to a corner of the Mac Devon's library where she had found a roll-top desk. Bored, as the boy and girl shoved books from the library into its drawers, the Boggart flitted off to catch some fish. The Boggart spent 3 days down on the seal rocks. Sometimes he would take the shape of a fish and disappear just as a hungry seal tried to gulp him down. Sometimes he would sit on the weed-covered rock and give an emerging seal just enough of a push to send it sliding back into the sea. He had an excellent time, and the seals, amiable, patient creatures, tolerated his antics. For them the Boggart was like the rocks for the ocean. He had always been there. Satisfied, the Boggart flittered back into Castle Keep while everyone slept. In the pantry, he helped himself to an orange, which he ate skin and all, and a hunk of cheese. He drank the top 3 inches from a carton of milk. He floated silently into the children's bedroom, where the girl and boy lay curled up in their sleeping bags at either side of a 4-poster bed, and tied together the laces of the girl's sneakers, and hid all the boy's socks in the girl's duffel bag. He loved the extra edge of being able to play tricks on 2 people at once, so they could blame each other. He ignored the parents, since their door was closed, and with a sigh of homecoming contentment, flittered into the library. A silver bar of moonlight shone through one of the narrow windows and fell upon a book of poetry lying on the open top of the roll-top desk. It was the last of the 6 books chosen by the brother and sister, which ranged from a centuries-old volume by King James I called Demonology to a sturdy history of the clans of the Western Highlands, and it was full of Scottish ballads. The Boggart was very partial to poetry, especially ballads. Over the years he had done a lot of reading, and even some tuneless private singing, in the library of the MacDevon family. He sat on the desktop, reading, entranced, until the shaft of moonlight moved sideways and fell away from the book, leaving it in the dark. Then suddenly he felt so agreeably tired that instead of flittering up to his usual high refuge, he crept into one of the inner compartments of the roll-top desk and fell asleep. And so he was still there the next morning, sleeping soundly, when the girl came in and packed all 6 books in there with him, wedging them with crumpled newspaper, turning the iron key to lock them inside the desk to be shipped to Edinburgh. At home, the girl surveyed her desk proudly. It looked pretty, set between the tall bookcase and door opposite her bed. She unhooked the key hanging from the thumbtack on her bulletin board above Almanzor's postcard, and unlocked the desk, rolling back its graceful wooden top. The Boggart, who had slept for 2 months and woken to find himself in a small, dark space surrounded by lurching books, came flittering resentfully out into the air. Soon, the Boggart sat on the shelf above the gas stove, among the pots and pans, chewing ecstatically. What was this wonderful, extraordinary new dish? He had always loved cheese, but this was delicious beyond belief, the quintessence of cheese. Mingled with it were several other alluring tastes, savoury and delectable. His horrified resentment of the strange, new world in which he found himself began to change into a cautious wondering. He finished the stolen piece of pizza, looked around unsuccessfully for more, and flittered down to drink from the girl's glass of lemonade. This was an extra treat. The MacDevon had drunk only tea, which the Boggart found uninteresting. The girl stomped on the pizza box and thrust it into the garbage bin. Turning back to the table, she saw her glass, now empty. She stared for a moment, then looked at her brother. "Why?" she said. "Obviously that was mine." "I didn't drink it," said Sid. "That would be disgusting." The girl looked from him to the empty glass. Up on his shelf, the Boggart chuckled silently to himself. "I want ice cream," the boy said. He went to the refrigerator and opened the freezer compartment, standing on tiptoe to peer in. "Oh good, we have chocolate and butter crunch." The Boggart's eyes grew round. The boy opened the main door of the refrigerator and took out a jar of fudge sauce. He unscrewed its cap and set the jar in the microwave, which produced a humming whir, ending with a loud clip and 3 bleeps, while the Boggart's eyes grew rounder still. By the time he saw the dish of ice cream put on the table, all different colours, with shining dark sauce topping each like a glossy hat, his mouth was watering so hard it was all he could do not to snatch one of the dishes out of the boy's hand. Instead, while the boy was busy eating, he flittered down and stole the fudge sauce jar, which still had an inch or so of sauce inside. He was about to help himself to a handful of ice cream as well, when the girl suddenly noticed that the 3 tubs were still on the table, in the warm room, and whisked them back into the freezer. The Boggart watched sadly as they disappeared. He had seen a refrigerator before. When he drove in Almanzor's hat to the store, he knew it to be a box with a metal door, which no Boggart could open. But the first taste of the fudge sauce sent all longing memories of ice cream right out of his head. What was this? The smooth, chocolatey sweetness was like an explosion of delight in his mouth. He ate by putting his small hand into the jar and scooping up a little at a time, slowly, happily, licking the sticky dark sauce lingeringly off each long finger. He was in love. He had forgotten all about Castle Keep. The astounding, luscious taste of fudge sauce made him feel that this new world in which he found himself just might be heaven. The girl said, "Hey, where's the jar of fudge sauce?" After that, the Boggart began his tricks gently. Over his centuries of mischief, he had learned not to rush things. The temptation was, of course, to dive into someone's life like a puppy running rampage in the tidy room, to turn everything upside down, all at once, in a great, playful eruption of trickery. But that was like gobbling a whole bag of candy in 5 minutes. In the long run, there was much more fun to be had by taking your time. So in a leisurely, temperate way, he started by hiding things. Father left his guitar in the bathroom as usual after his morning shave, came back next morning and reached for it sleepily, and found it gone. He turned the whole bathroom upside down in an unsuccessful search, and only when he was frustrated and late for his job did his wife come across the guitar quite by accident in the bedroom. "Where did you find it?" "It was under the bed." "What was it doing there?" "Well, you have to admit that's a more normal place than a bathroom." And the Boggart sat there listening, smiling. He would not play another trick on the father until he had similarly removed the girl's homeschool books from her bedroom desk to the kitchen vegetable rack, the mother's gardening patch from the hallway coat rack to the upstairs linen cupboard, and the boy's bowling ball to the basement laundry room. And, in a careful patterning, these tricks would be interspersed with others. For instance, the Boggart enjoyed moving a chair or lamp 2 feet away from its customary place, so that it had to be moved back, usually by the father. If the girl tidied the bedroom drawer, the Boggart jumbled things up again. When the boy organised all the books on his shelves, Vandals boring, police boring, the Boggart moved them into a different order overnight using what he felt was an artistic pattern, with all the vowels lumped together in the middle of the alphabet. And when the mother filled the sugar bowl with sugar one day, she found next morning that it was full of salt. The discovery was rather noisy, since the father had just put a heaping spoonful into his tea, stirred it briskly, and taken a large gulp. The family reacted to all this in a satisfyingly predictable manner. At first, each of them blamed himself or herself for absent-mindedness. How could I have actually left that there? They would think, helplessly. But after a while, they began privately to suspect that the absent-mindedness belonged to someone else. It was my wife who moved my guitar, but she's forgotten. Slowly, this became a mutual irritation, and as the Boggart's tricks became progressively more obvious, it grew into a conviction, in everyone's separate mind, that some other member of the family was deliberately playing practical jokes. Annie, I wish you'd stop throwing my bowling ball down the stairs to prove some point. It's not funny. I'm not the one who did that. But who else would do it? The Boggart hugged himself as he listened to the spurts and flares of impatience. This was the prelude. This beginning time was his private pleasure, the time in which only he knew what was really happening. Soon, they would move to the next, to the moment when he would push them over the edge, into the delicious discovery of the real inventor of all the tricks and jokes. After that, there would come a different pleasure. They would realise they had a Boggart in the house, and live with him according to the time-honoured rules. He would keep them from becoming bored. They would, on the whole, enjoy him, and he would be part of the family, like a quirky, but valued relative, just as he had been for so long with the MacDevon. It's just you, is it then, my Manny? I'll be after you one of these days. The Boggart's tricks were not daily events. He had no interest in trying out a joke unless he was fairly sure he would find it funny, so days would go by in which he did no mischief, but only explored, still cautiously, the place in which he now lived. He also rested, in his usual erratic pattern, with infrequent but long periods of sleep. In the girl's bedroom, he had found the shelf on which 4 of the books from the Mac Evans library now stood. The other 2, Demonology and the book about the clans, were in the boys' room. She had set them apart from the other books, propped between 2 heavy brass hen-shaped vases serving as bookends. Inside one of these vases, on a bed of cotton balls stolen from the bathroom, the Boggart slept. Once in a while, roused by formless dreams in which he heard the waves lapping on Loch Lomond or the distant bark of a seal, he would reach a long arm out of the vase and touch, for comfort, the cover of the Book of Scottish Ballads from Castle Keep. The parakeet, Francesco, discovered him in his brass vase not long after he chose it as his bed. Francesco was an unfriendly bard who spent most of his time trying to get away from his masters, and had taken to the vase long before the Boggart as his special spot. The day he found the Boggart, the creature was asleep. He woke to find Francesco's head poking into the top of his vase, and reached up crossly to give his beak a violent tweak. Francesco twittered, flew backward, and fell off the bookcase. He gave the Boggart's vase a wide berth after that, but the Boggart occasionally amused himself by drinking Francesco's water from one side of his bowl while he lapped it from the other, or balancing spiky, unexpected objects onto the bar of his cage just as he prepared to land. Francesco didn't know what to make of him. His life had never contained an invisible nuisance before. Whenever he sensed the Boggart was near, he would crouch warily in a corner with his feathers pricked. The family began to notice this after a while, and decided with regret that their bird, though only a year old, must already be senile. After the sheltered life he had led for so long in Castle Keep, the Boggart was at first baffled by the new house. In the castle he had never encountered anything electrical, since the MacDevon was a wizard, and always flatly refused to have electricity. The first time the Boggart saw the mother switching on a light, he was astounded. Clearly she, like himself, could work magic. This was confirmed when he saw her in the kitchen, with a magical wine whisk that beat eggs all on its own at her command, and a magic kettle that boiled water without being set on the stove. The Boggart decided she must be a witch. It took him several days to realise everyone else around him was capable of the same magic by pressing a switch that brought electric current out of a fire. After that, electricity became a challenge. The Boggart had to see whether this amazing, strange power could be mastered by his own magic. Sure enough, it could. After a little practice, he could hover behind the mother in the kitchen and make her beater stop and go backward, producing some gratifying splashing and shrieks. He could make the lights flicker as if a bulb were about to burn out, or make the telephone ring even though nobody was calling. The Boggart chuckled, and Francesco hissed at him from underneath an armchair. He had taken to hiding under things rather than flying onto them after the vase incident, adding to the family's belief he was a demented bird. The Boggart took care not to repeat the same trick often. Instead, he tried others, like turning the television off without touching the switch at the climax of a movie, or turning it on in the middle of the night. Father called a repairman, who charged him and told him there was nothing wrong with the set. One day, the boy was putting the sandwich in a box. "Leaving for my hockey game," he called, before speeding out the door. The Boggart sat on the table, watching hungrily. He had discovered that he loved peanut butter, but never found himself in control of all the makings for the peanut butter and jelly sandwich that went every day into the boy's mouth. Watching him slather chunky peanut butter on one piece of bread and glistening blackberry jelly on the other, he was filled with such greed that he decided he absolutely must get to the sandwich before the boy did. So when he fitted the sandwich inside the neat plastic bag into the plastic box, the Boggart slipped in with it. Francesco sat in a corner of the room, taut and nervous as the boy disappeared toward the front door. Then he instantly relaxed and strolled over toward the table, fluttering his wings. The Boggart bounced up and down in the box as Sid ran. He clung to a hinge, fending off the apple with his feet, listening to roaring sounds. Like all Boggarts, he could alter his size and shape as he chose, but it was uncomfortable to stay at a forced size for more than an hour or two, and by the time Sid opened his box at lunchtime, the Boggart was decidedly stiff and cramped. But that hadn't stopped him from eating the boy's sandwich. Once the box had stopped its bouncing, the Boggart had pulled open the plastic bag and settled himself down to chomp happily through the sticky meld of jelly, peanut butter, and bread. Now he was full and sleepy, and the plastic bag held nothing but crumbs. The boy stared at them in outrage when he opened the box. "Somebody stole my sandwich." He slammed the box shut before the Boggart could get back in. After that, he clung desperately to the boy's collar while he raced back to hockey practice. In the locker room, the Boggart hovered nervously, puzzling over the fact that boys so young should be putting on the kind of protective equipment only worn, in his own experience, by medieval knights practicing for a joust. But once he was out on the hockey rink, sheltering breathless inside the boy's face mask as he whizzed over the ice, he realised nothing had changed. This was a joust. It was just as passionate and just as dangerous, even though conducted by children. Admittedly, they were whacking with their weapons not at each other, at least not often, but at the small rounded black object they seemed to call a puck. Some old, dark sorcery at work there, the Boggart thought suspiciously. Why else call your victim by one of the names of the most ancient, good spirit of all? But they were certainly preparing for a major contest, all of them battling to be thought worthy of competing in the tournament. He was so deep in these reflections, sitting on the boy's shoulder while he waited on the bench, that he was taken by surprise when a shout from the coach whirled the next forward line out onto the ice. Sid dived into the game so fast that the Boggart no time to shelter inside his face mask. He grabbed one of its bars from the outside and hung on, desperately dangling. Far down the ice, a defence player hit the puck, and it rose up and flew toward the boy. Caught off balance, the boy could only dodge sideways, so the puck narrowly missed his helmet. It hit the Boggart instead. Nobody was ever able to report precisely what happened. The details were too fast for a human eye to see. The puck disappeared, vaporized by contact with the power of the old magic. But the Boggart, jolted by the impact, even though Boggarts cannot be hurt or feel pain, became suddenly visible. Curled up into a small, dense shape, he shot across the ice, looking just like a hockey puck. And the same defence player, a big, aggressive boy, swung back his stick joyously and hit him high into the air. The Boggart puck hurtled over the heads of the teams, but instead of falling down again, it flew on, making a strange whistling sound. It rolled high into the stadium, flying in circles, faster and faster, around and around. The players stood frozen on the ice, looking up. The coach and umpires and substitutes gaped from the sidelines. Furious, manic, the Boggart wheeled once more and disappeared. The stadium was silent, as everyone waited for the sound of the puck falling, and heard nothing. The coach, who had felt a cold terror while he watched, suddenly found his voice. "What are you waiting for?" He threw another puck onto the ice. Let's play ball. As if wakened from a dream, the players began moving again, first slowly, then faster, as the game took on its own new momentum. Every boy on the ice was trying to forget, to pretend he had not seen what he had seen. How could a hockey puck fly in circles, whistling? So they played even more furiously than before, as if they were opposing not their own classmates, but some hated rival team. Suddenly, with all the speed and power of the wild magic, the Boggart was back, diving vengefully between two players, tipping one sideways so ferociously that he seemed to turn a cartwheel. The player's stick snapped in two, his arms and legs whirled. He hurtled on his back across the ice, and his head crashed against the wall. The player lay still, dead. After the hockey game incident, the Boggart had been feeling guilty. It was an emotion he had never felt before, and he found it very uncomfortable. He knew he had given the boy a bad time, in ways he hadn't intended. Robbing his sandwich was one thing, what had happened next was more serious. What's more, he, the Boggart, had broken his own rules. He had attacked the player on the ice not for fun but for revenge. The laws of the wild magic allowed this as a defence against evil and murder, but not against an accidental whack from a hockey puck. So the Boggart wanted to do something nice for the boy. He had thought back over all his brief experience to find the thing that seemed to give the boy the most pleasure, and felt he had found the answer. He had made him a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It wasn't an elegant sandwich, because it had been done in a hurry during the few hasty minutes when the girl was making lunch with the ingredients. Hovering close and invisible over her hands, and flickering fast through the air like a mad hummingbird, the Boggart had managed to grab 2 slices of bread, a big handful of peanut butter and a handful of jelly. He had then put them all together as fast as he could, before the jelly leaked through his fingers or the bread, very healthy, but very grumbly, fell apart. Then he flittered off to the boy's bedroom, carrying a sandwich which looked rather like the planet Saturn surrounded by its rings, an apple-sized blob of peanut butter encased in bread, with a rim of bread crust out of which red jelly oozed like thick blood. He put the sandwich down, now with a sigh of relief and some regret, since the smell of peanut butter was making him ravenous. Before he could be tempted to eat it, he flittered out of the room and back to his hen-baz refuge on the girl's bookshelf. Good deeds were tiring, though surprisingly satisfying, and he needed a rest. He curled up on his bed of cotton balls, smiling contentedly for perhaps a 3-day sleep. The boy came running upstairs, and without switching on his bedroom light, settled himself happily down to his desk. He yelled, and slowly and stickily he stood up, for the Boggart had carefully left his gift in the place where he felt Sid was most likely to see it, his computer chair. Almanzo sent the girl another postcard. The picture showed the small island Staffa, with dark cliff-slide carvings where he was on a river troll hunt. The postcard said, Staffa is 7 miles away in Mendelssohn. He's the man who wrote the wedding march song you always hear in cartoons. Composed Fingal's Cave there, about a mysterious cave with mysterious echoes. I am hunting trolls with my uncle for someone who hired us. The folks who hired us seemed a bit suspicious, in my opinion. A big bald fellow like a gorilla and a very stuck-up boy in a suit, who goes around wearing a suit every day. The right way, I mean. I hope you consider it. Yours truly, Almanzo. The girl stuck the postcard up on her bulletin board next to a Scottish seal, and wrote a reply of her own. She scribbled at the bottom, in small hasty letters, mysterious things are happening here, like the echoes in Fingal's Cave. It's a Boggart, Almanzo wrote back. He's a spirit, but not something left over from a dead person, one who lives in the family and plays tricks. The Scots call him a Boggart. In Wales he's called a Boggart. Dunno what the English call him. A Boggart's a person himself, just not human. And you can't see him or hear him, not unless he wants you to. He's not a bad fellow, he's like the kid, really, wants to have fun. Chapter 3. The Boggart had woken only 2 hours before, on his cotton ball bed in the vase on the girl's shelf. He stretched, and gave a large, happy yawn. He wondered why he felt so cheerful, and remembered his good deed, the gift of a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. The cheerfulness was a pleasant surprise, though the good deed had involved so much effort he didn't especially want to repeat it. He flittered up out of the vase, and sat on the edge of the bookshelf. The daylight was beginning to die, at this time of year when the sun went down early. Outside the window, a half-moon hung in the sky, which was tinged a pinkish violet after the sun set. A gust of wind shifted the top shoots of the tall holly bush that grew beside the house. The Boggart stiffened, as if he were hearing a warning sound, and all at once realised what they would don next. Samhain. The Boggart clung to the oldest Celtic beliefs that had been in his head for 2,000 years or more. The ancient eve of Samhain was the marker between summer and winter. From midnight on, the world was ruled all through the winter by the skinny, blue-faced hag, the Gaelic Chipper. All summer long, The Gaelic her had been shut up inside a stone, a grey stone lying under a holly tree. But on the eve of Samhain she sprang up out of the stone, with her black eyes glittering like cold pebbles in her pinched blue face, and she seized her staff and went about the countryside striking at the earth to call green growth. Her breath frosted the windows and set icicles on branches and the corners of roofs, and when she sang her terrible winter song into the sky, the words froze into snowflakes and whirled down to cover the bare trees and mount deep drifts against houses and barns. The red-berried holly was one of the few plants to survive unchanged through her icy dominion, and so people would set branches of holly over their doors and windows and mantles to persuade her to stay out. And on their doorsteps they left harvest offerings of vegetables and fruit, so she would eat there, instead of storming into their kitchens in a whirl of hail and snow. The Boggart was alarmed. Now it was the eve of Samhain once more, and the Gaelic would be out roaming the world, and nobody in this house had done anything to protect it against her wrath. Her wrinkled blue face would be at the window soon, her cold breath blowing down the chimney. In a panic, the Boggart flittered downstairs and out through the part-open front door. He quivered as he saw creatures standing out there, surely part of the wild retinue of the Gaelic. But then, his sense told him they were only the boy and girl from his family dressed in funny costumes. He saw with relief they had at least left out a pumpkin on the step as an offering, but it was not chopped up small as it properly should be for the winter hag's toothless jaws. He dived down and snatched up the pumpkin and hastily dropped it on the step, smashing it into small pieces, ignoring the tiresome interruption of the father, who chose the moment to come out the front door. Then he flitted back indoors to find other ways of defending the house against the rage of the blue-faced Gaelic. The Boggart paused briefly in his invisible activities and looked down. His eyes widened as he saw approaching in the shadows, dim-lit and terrible, the dark, hunched figure of the winter hag herself. There she was, tapping with her stick at trees and bushes, advancing on him. Her blue face glowed pale and ghastly. She drew closer, and he could feel already the icy breath that would clamp the long dead months of winter over the lochs and hills like a shroud. She was on her way to eat up this house, to envelop it in ice, but he was ready for her. They were fortunate, this foolish, unprepared family, that they had a Boggart to take precautions for them. He dived hastily back toward the house. As the stooped figure of the Gaelic turned in from a dark street, all hell broke loose. A chair hurtled from one bedroom window, smashing into pieces on the ground. A bookcase from another, scattering books that did not drop as they should, but seemed to drift down through the air, their pages fluttering like the wings of birds. There was a loud, shrieking voice, calling out words in a language nobody could understand, and from both sides of the house, great blasts of icy water leaped forward at the blue-faced hag, and she crumpled into a heap of dark clothes on the ground. The water fell away, and the voice dropped into silence. In the darkness, the children moved again, out of a sudden paralysis. The girl came down the path from the front door. She bent down by the figure in a dark witch robe and pulled off the blue plastic mask held over the face by a rubber band. It was her mother, Annie. She began in a furious voice. "It wasn't me," said her daughter. "It was a Boggart." The Boggart was dancing on the edge of the bookshelf, delighted. He had been lying about to drift into a half-sleep, but when the girl had spoken his name, he had shot up into the air, wide awake, filled with joy. They had recognized him. Finally, after all this time, they had realized he was there. For the first time since the Devon had died, he could begin living with friends. The girl was explaining to her brother, in as much detail as she could remember, everything Almanzo had written about Boggarts. Her brother stood up, then paused suddenly, looking surprised. He touched his cheek. "What's the matter?" said the girl, and also paused, putting her hand to her own face. The boy said, bemused, "It was like someone stroked my cheek." "Someone's hand." "That's right," the girl said. "A very small hand." They stared at each other. Somewhere in the room, faint, growing, there was a slow, happy sound of the purring of a cat. Chapter 4. The Boggart clung invisibly and uncomfortably to the handlebars of the bicycle the girl was riding next to her brother, because he wanted to be with his two new friends. As they went over a bump, he made a small, self-pitying sound, and it vibrated through the air like the whimper of a lost puppy. The girl and boy stiffened, and looked nervously at each other. The boy said, "It's the creep." The Boggart watched with approval as he followed the girl and boy into the corner store. He relaxed again now that the three of them were alone. "My friends," he thought joyously. He was filled with the instinct for happy, meaningless mischief, which was his normal state of mind, and debated with himself how best to share it with them. What could he do that would make them smile? The girl reached for a bag of surfboards on a shelf. Then she glanced across the shop and stood frozen, staring. eyed doll was climbing out of a box of antique toys which stood on a table at the far end of the shop. Another followed it, then a third. The third had its head missing, but didn't mind. The 3 dolls stood on the table facing the girl, holding hands in a line, and danced, floppily, first in one direction then back again. 1, 2, 3, hop. 1, 2, 3, hop. 1, 2, 3, hop. The boy looked up swiftly. His eyes widened, and he dropped the cola cubes he was buying, and instead of falling to the ground, the glass floated back to the shelf from which it had come. The dolls danced on, and not far away an antique dressed Macare's dummy began to sway to the same rhythm. So did the silk flowers in a vase on the other side of the shop, and the tall, dry grasses standing in an empty blanca chest. So did the group of chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, making a soft jingling sound on the face of every clock in the shop, and there were more than a dozen. The hands twirled gaily around. Gently, the shop vibrated to the beat of the doll's slow dance, and the girl and boy looked at each other, and began to laugh. "He's doing it for us," the boy said. "He's putting on a show." The girl called out, "It's lovely, Boggart." An umbrella stand full of umbrellas gave a small drunken lurch, and one by one the umbrellas flew out of it to the ceiling, and opened, and hung there like bright, hovering parachutes, swaying in time. A handsome brocade armchair rose 3 feet off the ground, slow and stately, and so did an old wooden church pew, creaking. 1, 2, 3, hop. 1, 2, 3, hop. Like a final flourish, a round table covered with a set of 12 delicate crystal glasses rose up, and hovered, but quivered in terror lest it to begin swaying to the rhythm of the dance. A red-haired employee with a name tag that said Jacob walked in and screamed. Dolls, clocks, and chandeliers were instantly still, but there was a whirling like a trapped flock of birds as the umbrellas folded back into their stand. The armchair lurched to the floor, and the girl pulled her brother out of the way as the heavy church pew floated through the air and down. There was a moment of dreadful, breathless silence. "It wasn't us! It wasn't us!" yelled the girl, and she seized her brother by the arm and ran with him out the door, into the street and away. They hid in the back of a theatre. A stage manager sat working the light board. It was a small and discreet door, specially cut a few years before, so the manager could slip in and out of the back row seat during performances without being seen. It opened onto a walkway next to the little room which enclosed the light board, and a staircase ran down from it and led, eventually, to the area backstage. The whole theatre was like a small rabbit warren. The girl led her brother up the staircase to the door, opened it quietly, and they went in. Before following, she half closed the door again and turned to face the stairwell. She said to the empty air, in a whisper, "Boggart, please don't do anything to get us into more trouble." There was silence, and the Boggart flittered in with her. He felt wounded by the implication that he might ever intend to damage anyone. Didn't the girl know Boggarts lived for mischief, not for harm? The girl and boy sat quietly in the back row, hoping nobody had noticed them. The Boggart watched the lights on the stage in the light. From the moment he entered the auditorium, he had been enchanted. He flittered over the seats to the manager's table, inquisitive. He flittered around the theatre, onto the stage, where he looked up and saw the battery of light instruments hanging from the roof grid, blazing at him, out again into the darkness of the auditorium. At the back of the house he saw a square of light and flittered over to investigate. Behind the window he saw the stage manager sitting at the light board, her fingers playing with a keyboard. This keyboard, it appeared, was the source of every change in the magical array of lights over the stage. Fascinated, the Boggart squeezed through a crack into the little room. The changes were gradual, but extraordinary. At first, the brightness of the lighting remained the same, but took on a faint reddish tinge, growing stronger in colour until it was a deep scarlet. The lighting changed colour again, and the stage manager realised it was going slowly through the spectrum. Red, orange, yellow. Sid slipped into a seat beside her. On the stage, the actors, occasionally looking nervously up at the light grid, went on speaking their lines. The lights turned from yellow to green, then darkened to blue. Up in the light booth, the stage manager was waving her arms. On stage, the lights changed from blue to indigo and merged into purple. Then the lights made a different kind of change. The purple glow which dominated the stage faded swiftly away into a clear light like early morning, fresh and cool. It rippled gently, as if wisps of cloud were floating over an unseen sun. "It's beautiful," the manager said. She settled back happily into her seat in awe. As the actors laughed, the light laughed with them, taking on a deeper brilliance. Unexpectedly, the theatre filled with slow, solemn music. The actors expressed surprise, and the light glimmered with this emotion too. "Lovely," said the manager. "I don't know who's doing this, but it's perfect." Inside the computer, the Boggart was beside himself with delight. He had taken the lights through the spectrum of all the colours as an exercise, a way of teaching himself how to use them. Now, he knew the language of light, and was speaking it by his own magic. He used the magic of this new technological world in which he found himself, and the mixing of the two magics was a wonder. Lyrical and mysterious, the lights shifted and flickered and glowed, like echoes of the words the bemused actors were saying on the stage. They lasted until the song. It was a song of mourning over a dead body, and its words were not actually sung, but spoken, because the character Polydor in the play claimed that he would weep if he tried to sing, but the words themselves, having been written by the man who was the greatest master of the English language, held an enchantment that cut right through the Boggart's magic to the Boggart himself. They reached his heart, and found in it the old, deep sorrow of his losses. Fear no more the heat of the sun, nor the furious winter's rages. Thou thy worldly task hast done, home art gone, and ta'en thy wages. Golden lads and girls all must, as chimney sweepers, come to dust. The words overwhelmed the Boggart, filling him with a terrible grief at the loss of his own home. He came blundering out of the computer that governed the theatre lights, and flittered back, unthinking, into the auditorium. He was filled with grief and longing, and the force of his feeling took hold of everyone inside the theatre, on this stage or behind it or in front of it. The whole place was possessed by his sorrow. Like a dark cloud, it swallowed the consciousness of everyone listening. The girl felt a misery blacker than anything she had ever felt before. The boy felt himself desolate and deserted. No exercise or harm thee, nor no witchcraft charm thee. Ghost unlaid forbear thee, nothing will come near thee. Quiet consummation have, and renown be thy grief. The voices fell silent, and in the dim light that was left, gradually the theatre began to fill with an eerie sound, which belonged not to the play, but to the Boggart, to the pain of life and loss that he was feeling. So, far away, coming closer, there was the throb of a muffled drumbeat. Ta-rum, ta-rum, ta-rum. And over it the plaintive music of a lament played on a single bagpipe, and over it too, like an echo, the curious husky sound of the shuffling of many feet. The sound grew louder and closer, intolerably close and loud, filling the theatre, so all the listeners inside it longed to flatten their hands against their ears to shut out the terrible wave of grief. Then, at the peak of the noise, it was gone, vanished, and the light died with it, leaving the theatre silent and dark. Chapter 5. Afterwards, the Boggart didn't listen to a word said by the humans who opened the door on him, and had only a vague, dwindling memory of the ferocious grief which had poured out of him minutes before. The weather changed very fast in his odd Boggart heart. He was soon busy watching a pair of city pigeons in the gutter, and wondering how best to creep up on them and tweak their tail feathers. The trickster was back at doing what he did best, and with most pleasure, inventing tricks. He grabbed onto his girl's shirt collar, and they left, passing a garden with bright yellow chrysanthemums, another neatly arrayed with late vegetables, set out in decorative precision as if they were flowers. The Boggart littered down and stole a Brussels sprout, then went to the boy's shoulder and sat there nibbling it raw. They'll probably have some explanation for those lights to wave it all away, the girl was saying wearily. She stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, and looked around. Where are you, Boggart? She demanded. The Boggart, hearing his name, looked at her thoughtfully from her brother's shoulder. These children were singularly poorly educated, compared to children of an earlier age like that wild man Zochap. Had nobody ever told them that Boggarts do not speak to human beings? She said, if we could just talk to him. He likes food, her brother said suddenly. The peanut butter sandwich, the jar of fudge sauce, the banana cream. My dad said I took off his plate last Sunday. He's greedy. I think we should go buy him some ice cream. The Boggart came and licked his lips. The girl searched her pockets and found some crumpled pounds. All right, Boggart, she said to the ear. Now you get to choose whether you want butter pecan or black raspberry, but you'll have to tell us. They ran down the road and around another corner, the Boggart clinging to the boy's collar, and in a little while they came to a major thoroughfare. The Boggart flinched and clung tighter. He stared at the neons scrawled brilliant over the window of Ed's ice cream shop as they went in. He gazed down in greedy astonishment at the tubs of 18 different flavours of ice cream. Before anyone could ask him, silently and invisibly he sent the hand and scoop of the girl behind the counter to the tub of his favourite, vanilla ice cream. The server looked uncertainly at her own hand as it served out the ice cream, and the girl said swiftly, and one mint chocolate chip and one coffee. You did say vanilla? Asked the server, dazed. Yeah, the girl said kindly and untruthfully. They took their 3 dishes of ice cream to a table like a tall mushroom, at which they stood. There you go, Boggart, the girl said, and put the vanilla ice cream in the middle of the table. She and her brother watched it closely as they spooned up their own, but nothing happened. Instead, A neon sign in the window reading Ed's ice cream flashed, off and on, in time to the cheerful music which filled the air. Like everyone else in the shop, the boy and girl stared at it. There was no way of telling whether the flashing was accidental or deliberate, though it was undoubtedly happening to the same beat as the music. Soon, the dish of vanilla ice cream was empty. The very last mouthful disappeared, as if it had evaporated. The boy said belligerently to the invisible Boggart, "Well, was it good?" "Delicious, thank you," said an old lady with a fruit hat standing at the next table, a spoonful of strawberry ice cream about to disappear into her mouth. She smiled. "How sweet of you to ask." The boy tried to spread a grin over his face, but never had to finish it, because at that point the lights went out. They came back, then flickered out again. The neon sign in the shop window was still flashing to the music. Beyond it, outside, the darkening street filled with lifelike blue fire. They heard muffled shouts and screams. "What's he doing?" the boy asked. He and his sister dove for the door. From his perch on the table, the Boggart had noticed the streetcar wires over the street. He saw an irresistible chance to play tricks on all the people in those streetcars. Out he went, joyously, and flittered up to a wire junction, and played with the power in the wires. He cut off the power from one car just as it reached the centre of an intersection, sent another one humming down the street even though the startled driver was trying to stop, dived back to the first to give it power again, just as the second car was about to crash into it. An old man at the back of the first streetcar fainted. People watching in the street screamed. Electricity danced along the wires like blue lightning. The Boggart laughed like a delighted child, and looked around for another kind of game. The traffic lights caught his eye. "Boggart!" the boy yelled, spinning around, facing upward. "Boggart! Stop it!" As the pedestrian signal changed to walk, the girl darted to join a group of people crossing the road. But the Boggart was playing with the traffic lights, and though the walk signal had changed, the green light for traffic had turned not to red but to a delicate turquoise blue. So the traffic didn't stop. There was a desperate honking of horns, a squealing of brakes, voices screamed, glass shattered, metal crashed into concrete. A car had crumpled its fender against a lamppost, and two people lay unmoving in the road. One of them was the girl. Chapter 6. There were many questions that could have been asked about the Boggart, such as, how had the Boggart managed to eat ice cream without a spoon, with his hand? Did he have hands? If you couldn't feel or see or hear him, how could he be solid enough to swallow the ice cream? Not to mention all the other things he liked to eat or drink. Where did they go? Did the Boggart have to go to the bathroom? Did he wear clothes? Why was he a he and not a she? Were there such things as she-Boggarts? Did Boggarts produce little Boggarts, or did they just live forever, so that little Boggarts weren't necessary? More important than any of this, where was the Boggart now? Annie's leg was propped up in a cast, since she had broken an ankle. Her head ached where she had banged it on the ground. Her side ached where she had cracked a rib. Her hip and thigh ached where, the doctor said, she was going to have a spectacular bruise. She had wakened in the rocking ambulance, to the sound of a siren and the sight of a paramedic and a wide-eyed Sid. Then, there had been a lot of people and questions and proddings and x-rays from assorted angles, and now here she was in the hospital for 2 days. That gave her lots of time to call Almanzo. When the ringing tone finally came at the other end, it was echoing an old-fashioned, a bell-like sound. After the third ring, Almanzo's voice said clearly, "Hello. Thank goodness you're there." Annie said, "I was afraid you'd be asleep at this time." There was a short pause. "Annie, you just caught me. I'm about to be off on a midnight boat ride. Thought you were a banshee wanting my soul again. What might you need just now?" She took a breath. "Almanzo, this is urgent. You have to tell me about the Boggart." After another moment's pause, Almanzo said cautiously, "Tell you what, we've got him." Annie said, "He's over here. He must have come with the furniture. He's making all kinds of trouble." "So that's it," Almanzo said. "There's been no sign of him. I thought he was asleep." "Tell me." "He lives in the castle. He belongs with the MacDevon. Or he used to. He's a jokey fellow, but he means no harm. He doesn't speak. Animals know. He's there, but not people, generally. Only Mr. MacDevon and I knew. How do you control him? Stop him doing things?" "You can't," Almanzo said. There was a blurry noise in the background. "I have to go, or I'll miss the will-o'-the-wisps." "We can't." "Not at all. He's an old thing. That's an old thing with capital letters, and they do what they do. They're outside the rules. They won't do anything unless it's what they want." "Annie, write to me. Tell me what's happening." "Okay," Annie said bleakly. "There's one thing. They sleep a lot. For days. Or weeks. Sometimes when you think he's not there, he's just asleep. I've got to go. I'll write to you. Love to you and your family, Almanzo said, and he was gone. Up on Annie's bookshelf the Boggart slept to a long, exhausted sleep, unbroken since the day of his travels into the theatre lightboard and the city traffic lights. He didn't stir, not even when the sky outside grew thick and ominous, full of grey clouds, and the first snowflakes began to float down. The snow fell for 2 days and nights, whirling in the wind that blew off the North Sea, muffling the brazen locks of Edinburgh, turning the whole city white. Annie wrote to Almanzo telling him all the details of the previous few weeks, but her letter crossed one from him. He sent her a fat envelope full of pictures of the Scottish Highlands and the Western Isles where he had butchered 6 trolls for steak, postcards and photographs of him standing next to the decapitated corpses with his uncle. They were wonderful images of dead trolls, misty purple mountains and grey blue lochs and seas. There was a big, romantic picture of Castle Keep brooding dark and lonely on its rock, and an even bigger one of the seals and selkies, all white, dark eyes and bristling whiskers. Almanzo wrote, I don't know what good it will do, but I think you should put these all over your bedroom walls. They might remind him of the outdoors where he ought to be. The problem will be how to persuade him to go there. The Boggart woke on a bright morning when the temperature outside the house was freezing. The first thing that he saw, in the clear light filling the room, was the hypnotic array of photographs of Appin, his castle, his landscape and loch, his friends the seals and selkies. He flittered from one picture to the next, filled suddenly with longing for the smell of the seaweed and damp fallen leaves, for the soft, salty air and the fine mist that was not quite rain, or draughty Castle Keep and the seagulls mewing around its roof. These pictures brought it all back to him, acutely, and at the same time reminded him he was in quite another place. The Boggart had little sense of geography, and made no distinction between one place or country and another inside the North American continent. But he did know, as instinctively as a bird or any other wild thing, that he was on the other side of a large ocean, a long way from home. He was consumed by a desperate homesickness. He flittered across to the window, and was startled by the whiteness. He had never seen snow so deep. It was mounted a foot high on the windowsills, against the glass, and the streets outside seemed all white and grey and black, with no colour anywhere. In banks and drifts the snow gleamed. Faintly, he heard voices and laughter, and saw the boy and his father throwing snowballs. The Boggart's homesickness faded a little. He looked out at this crisp, glittering world, fascinated. In the winters of his part of Scotland, snow did not fall often, and it did not lie for long. Only the mountain tops were white until spring. The snowy street beckoned him. He wanted to be out there, sharing the sunshine and brilliant wideness. He flittered downstairs, hoping someone might open a door. He had learned already that his new house, unlike Castle Keep, was tightly closed, with no cracks or crannies through which a Boggart could come and go. The windows had not only one layer of glass, but 2. These people seemed to be determined to keep out the good, fresh air. He hovered hopefully in the front hall, and in a little while his patience was rewarded. The boy came bursting in, his face gleaming red, and disappeared into the bathroom. When he came out, the Boggart dived to his shoulder, and sat there clutching the jacket collar for balance as he ran outdoors again. It wasn't what he had expected at all. The shock nearly paralysed him. In an instant, the fiercely cold air sucked the energy out of his insubstantial, invisible body like a vacuum cleaner sucking out dust. His coastal Scottish climate was gentle in comparison. Gasping for consciousness, he wound his long fingers in the fledging the boy's hood, and with his last thread of strength, hauled himself over the edge, down into the boy's shirt. The boy wriggled, feeling the prickle of cold, but then ducked to avoid a snowball, and forgot everything but the swift, noisy compulsion to grab up his own handful of snow and send it whizzing back. He yelled in triumph as the snowball hit his dad's shoulder, and the Boggart winced as the noise of the yell flooded his chilly ears. For the last 10 minutes of the snow fight, the Boggart clung to the inside of the shirt, tucked in the gap above his collarbone. He was bounced around horribly every time the arm connected to the collarbone through a snowball, but at least he was close to the warmth of the boy's skin, protected from the terrible cold of the winter air outside. When at last the cold was too much even for the boy, and he came running back indoors shouting for hot chocolate, the Boggart squeezed himself out while the boy was taking off his jacket, and flittered feebly back upstairs. He sat on the edge of the girl's bookshelf, growing warmer in the house shut so wisely against the bitter winter air, and gazed at the pictures of green, Scottish hillsides for a long time. The next day, the girl, who was still stuck in bed, decided to write a story in a notebook. It's a story about Francesco joining the circus, she said, handing it to her brother. The boy read the sheet, frowned, and put it back in front of his sister. "Why don't you like it?" she said. Then she paused, looking at the page. It read, Francesco was a demented parakeet, Some would say he was even the me, G.I. arrayed, doll dommed up, fine not right in the head. One day he decided since he didn't get enough respect, the me, G.I. arrayed, doll dommed up, fine and set off to fulfill his dearest dream to become a clown. Annie's mouth fell open at the intrusive lines of capital letters. I never wrote that, she said. She picked up her pen and wrote, Francesco is a stupid word, and the strange invading words the me, G.I. arrayed, doll dommed up, fine appeared nearby. She breathed heavily. All down the page, the same words appeared. The me, G.I. arrayed, doll dommed up, fine. From the curtain rod, the Boggart looked down peevishly. He felt a wave of dislike for his surroundings. He wanted to leave at once. He looked around for objects that might encourage the process. There was a loud crash, and a shriek as he hurtled a fat foot through the air so it hit the wall, narrowly missing the boy. The carpet was covered with pieces of flower pot, spilled earth, and scattered yellow chrysanthemums. A shower of pencils rattled against the wall and fell on the broken flowers. The girl had leapt up to crouch in a corner, wide-eyed, a crouch under each arm. She shouted, Stop it, Boggart. Stop. Another book whisked through the air from the bookshelves, and she ducked, but the book grazed her forehead before dropping to the ground. She staggered, and a bright trickle of blood appeared above her brow. A crash came from downstairs, where the Boggart had moved to throw a vase. Chapter 6. The night was clear and cold, and the street lights cast harsh, black shadows on the dingy white snowbanks edging the sidewalks. From the landing window, the Boggart tried to look up, to see the friendly prickle of the stars in the dark sky, but breeze enclosed him, and there were no stars to be seen. The house was sleeping, and he could not get outside. Even if he could, no creature would be stirring out there. It was too cold. The Boggart was lonely. He could play tricks, of course. Right this moment, he could make the sound of a howling wolf, or a clanking chain, or moan heart-rendingly like a ghost. His two friends might appreciate that, but nobody else in this house would, especially not the hostile Francesco. He flittered into the girl's room, and in the light that crept around the blind from the street lights outside, gazed longingly at the pictures of the mountains of Argyll, and the rocks where the seals lived, and wished he were there. That morning, hovering near the table, the Boggart smiled. He was interested in the applesauce he found in the kitchen, and dipped one long finger into it, tasted, and shivered with pleasure. The kitchen had become his favourite room in the house. Here he could be distracted by food, and forget that he was in the wrong place. The doorbell rang, and the girl jumped. I'll get it, said the boy. He pushed back his chair and went out, and the Boggart sat down happily on the rim of his cereal bowl and drank the remaining pool of milk. Extremely faint was an audible slurping sound. It was like a dripping tap. Almanzo. The girl fumbled happily for her crutches as Almanzo strode into the house with a large, frozen, green steak over his shoulder. Hello, hen, he said. Nice to see you vertical again. Got some troll meat for you. I've heard, not content with getting you knocked down by a bus, our friend has been throwing things about again. I'd like to have a word with your Boggart. The Boggart flittered up to a shelf and regarded Almanzo. Here was a man of experience. At last. Where is he? Said Almanzo. He was a green boy, and looked very pale standing there in the kitchen. He spoke to the ceiling. Are you there, then, my laddie? Up in one of the bedrooms. I would guess, said the girl. He sleeps a lot. Just as well, said Almanzo. Come on, then. They tripped upstairs. The Boggart forgot about Almanzo and dived happily at the applesauce, which nobody had put back in the refrigerator. It was silent upstairs. That's the trouble, Almanzo was saying. You only find out if he doesn't like you, because then he throws something. He glanced down at the bed and paused, looking at a litter of papers. Then he picked up the top sheet. Then he sat down, staring at it. Annie, he said in a suddenly tight voice. What's this? There was the Francesco quotation, with the repeated invading capitals, the me, G.I. arrayed, doll dommed up, hi. That's Gallic. Almanzo read the words aloud, and they sounded quite different from the way they looked on the page. Gallic? Do you speak Gallic? Of course he does. Annie said. He's Scottish. Or is it Irish? I'm never quite sure what exactly. Almanzo said absently. Yes, I do. What does it mean, then? It means, I want to go to my own country. Soon Almanzo stood by the front door, pulling on his coat and looking worried. He had spent a long time speaking Gallic into the ear, and writing it into the notebook, in an attempt to communicate with the Boggart, but there had been no response, and now it was time for him to go selkie spotting. He said, let me know if anything happens, anything at all. I wish your Boggart were more talkative. Hearing his name spoken in the warm, old-fashioned accent, the Boggart came flittering out of the kitchen, wiping a smear of applesauce from his face. but the door had closed. Almanzo was gone. The girl sat with a notebook open, writing, "Boggart, come talk to us. Boggart, where are you? Boggart, it's your turn." The Boggart flittered past the landing window on his way to the girl's bedroom and paused, staring out. Softly, he could hear a sound that caught at his heart, carrying him back to the grey waters and the rocky shore of Loch Lomond. He saw them, out in the sky, high over the snowy treetops. Seagulls, wheeling, drifting, calling, their familiar cry. These were not the seagulls of the Hebrides, but the Boggart did not know that. They were seagulls. Their voices were calling them home. Yet again he flittered into the girl's room and gazed longingly at the pictures of the seals on the rocks, the misty islands, and bleak Castle Keep. This was not home for an old thing, nor ever would be. The Boggart knew what he must do. He looked at the bulletin board, at the photograph of the brother and sister throwing snow at each other, and he reached out the long fingers of his insubstantial hand and touched each laughing face. Then he turned away. With his keen, ageless ears, he listened for the drip of ink onto the notebook, and flittered toward it. In the notebook, Annie saw a starry sky patterned with constellations, striped by the bright path of the Milky Way. Something moved across the page, a speedy little ship. It was intensely bright, brighter than anything she had ever seen on a piece of paper before, and it looked for all the world like a blue flame. "Aha," she exclaimed. "That blue flame is the Boggart." Oh no. A drawing of Francesco, which had been affected by the magic, was flying through the starry sky. He's going to eat the Boggart. But the Boggart didn't realise this, and didn't slow down. Even as a blip on a notebook page, the Boggart was still delighting in mischief. "Boggart, stop," the girl said. She drew a barrier to block the parakeet from flying at him with his mouth open, aimed at the speeding blue flame, and again she drew obstacles to keep away Francesco, who was spinning helplessly as the flame sped across the page. The girl got silent and intent. She sat hunched over the paper, working furiously. The moving flame could not be stopped. It sped on, faster and faster, driven by some huge determination of its own, as her obstacles disappeared and turned into stars. The stars prickling in the black sky of the page quivered into an intense wave of sound. Gradually they blurred and grew dim, and all the time the blue arrow of flame raced deeper through the night sky and into space. Finally she sat back in her chair, her face pale, her hand dropped limp beside the notebook. She said in an anguished whisper, "It's a black hole, he's going into it. I can't stop him." And all at once the book was filled by a dark, glimmering, pulsating whirlpool, a hole of ferocious energy pulling every thread of light into its dead black heart, and the blue flame dived into its centre and disappeared. The dark whirlpool filled it, throbbing, a living picture of death. The girls scribbled different doodles such as ladders and ropes for the Boggart to grab hold of, but nothing changed. The black hole hung there, dreadful and changing, empty. Tears prickled in Annie's eyes. That night, Annie and Seth didn't sleep. They longed to be able to talk to Almanzo, who was the only one who might know how to rescue the mysterious friend. Maybe now that it was midnight, Almanzo would be finished with his selkie spotting or river troll hunting or Willow, who was watching, or whatever it was he did during the days. Annie crept downstairs to the kitchen, past Francesco's eyes, peering from under the table before he scurried into a mouse hole, closed the door and dialed Almanzo's number. There was a great deal of ringing and then a very blurry voice. "Hello, Almanzo, it's Annie. For pain's sake, I'm trying to round up the sprites." "I'm sorry," Annie said, "but it's an emergency. I've lost the Boggart." "Lost him? I'll tap at your kitchen door," Almanzo said quickly, and slammed down his phone. In a little while he heard a scuffling outside the door, and opened it to find Almanzo, green-faced, shaking thick snow from his jacket and feathered cap. "It's been snowing for 3 hours, too deep to plough. I came on skis." Almanzo reached down and unlaced his boots. "Let's get to the notebook and try something." Annie carefully closed her door, and Almanzo sat down at the desk like a pianist facing the start of a concerto. He took a deep breath. "Right," he said. "Here we go." For more than 2 hours he worked at the notebook, rendering artistic illustrations and writing spells in complex languages of old, trying to reach the area into which the Boggart had disappeared. But Almanzo was hunting for a treasure which was alive, and it was not simply lost, it was deliberately eluding him. The creature of mischief was playing a terrible game of his own, not understanding there were perils in the world of a notebook from which even he might not be able to escape. If he was playing hide-and-seek with them, he might at any moment doom himself to go on playing it forever. Almanzo sat hunched, drawing rapidly. Now and then, Annie suggested an idea of her own. Would it work if you drew him a magic portal? But that would have been too simple. and most of the things Almanzo was doing were so complex and obscure it was impossible to help him. Again and again he tried to write magic into the notebook in which, somewhere, the Boggart was either hiding or trapped. Soon Sid came in to join them. "Well, we've been trying for 3 hours, Almanzo said as a grandfather clock struck. "Annie, I think there's only one thing left to do." "What's that?" "The first time to when we went into the book and see what happens." He looked across at Annie. "But to do that, we have to go down the black wall, too." "Down the black wall? Could we get trapped like the Boggart if we did that?" "Perhaps. On the other hand, we might find ourselves face to face with the Boggart. If we close the notebook at this point, we'll lose the black hole forever and the Boggart inside it." "Don't do it," said Annie in a panic. Almanzo closed his eyes. "We'll have to take the risk, then." His fingers moved to the page again, and it filled with the black sky and the prickling stars of the black hole. One star moved off the paper and out of sight, then another. Rays flashed in the centre of the starry picture, which Almanzo translated to them. "Beware for your beast. Danger. Beware for your life. You're nearing a black wall. Change your course." There was the quivering in the sky, as when the Boggart's cheerful blue arrow of flame was streaking toward disaster. It grew stronger, until the stars were no longer still points of light, but small, juddering scribbles, jerking up and down. The sense of vibration consumed Annie's consciousness until she felt as if the floor under her feet were shaking. Propped on her crutches, she grabbed Almanzo's shoulder with one hand, and Sid's arm with the other. "Beware, beware, beware." The room filled with the whirling, pulsing dark funnel that was the black wall, sucking them down, and in a terrifying, giddy fall, they plunged into its black centre, the heart of death, taking their breath, taking all light from their eyes, all sound from their ears. Annie opened her eyes and saw Castle Keep. It was a clear, beautiful image, clearer than any picture drawn in a notebook, or even in real life. It swayed a little, as though they were looking at it from a boat. A seagull swept across the sky, calling its plaintive cry. They were indeed in a boat, tossing gently, looking inland from the sea at the misty grey hills of the Highlands of Scotland, and the stark, chunky shape of Castle Keep, set on its small rocky island. There was the whine of the wind, and the lapping of the waves, the smell of the sea. There was also a honking bark, and from other rocks closer by, a dark sail heaved itself up and slid into the waves. The sail turned to look at Annie, and for an instant she was staring into its wide, black eyes. Castle Keep loomed before them across the grey-blue waves, yet never grew closer. If they were in a boat, it was not moving, but waiting. They heard a voice, far away but clear, a husky, dusty, creaky voice that seemed not to have been used for a very long time, yet filled the room around them. "For me, G.I. Arrayed, doll don't do up time," it said, softly, plaintive as a seagull. "For me, G.I. Arrayed, doll don't do up time." Annie whispered, "It's the Boggart. That's the piece of Gaelic he wrote before. I want to go to my own country." Almanzo said, "That's the Boggart talking." The husky voice spoke again, this time in a faltering, uncertain English. "I want to go to my own country," it said. "My own country." Then it faded into the wash of the waves, and the sound of the wind. They were in a dark room again, filled with the black space and prickling stars of the black wall, peaceful, unmoving, silent. Chapter 7. It was a Saturday morning in Boat Upton, 4 days after Christmas, and Almanzo was helping his uncle load boxes into his boat. Business was brisk, and they had sold 19 of the 6 dozen boxes of troll steak. There was a fine mist of rain in the air, and clouds hung ragged and low over the hills and the islands. But seagulls were weaving endlessly to and fro over the sea, calling, calling. Almanzo looked up at them curiously, wondering what could be making them so restless on a dank, winter day. A smaller boat zigzagged toward them, and stopped with a final violent tremor and cough. A short, white-haired postman got out. He looked like neither a kid nor adult. The waves crashed the boat into a rock, and the postman was thrown onto his face in the sand. Dangerous occupation. Mail delivery, Almanzo said solemnly. "You should take up troll hunting. Merry Christmas to you." "A happy holiday to you too," said Michael. He handed over several boxes and a package of post, then reached back into his bag. "There is a registered piece for Almanzo here. A present, I dare say." He pulled out a brown padded envelope and staggered suddenly, juggling the envelope between his 2 hands as if it were all at once very hot, or very heavy. He handed it hastily to Almanzo, who took it warily, but was surprised to find it extremely light. "Sign here," Michael said. Almanzo signed his name. Almanzo looked at the stamps on his package, and the warnings printed all over it in careful capital letters. Fragile. Urgent. Handle with care. Dear Almanzo, said the letter, when he opened it. Please use this money to buy the Boggart some ice cream as a Christmas present. Thanks for helping. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. Sign Annie. P.S. We miss you too. Love, Annie said. That night, light and music and laughter poured out of the windows and door of the village hall, with the rhythm of dancing feet and furious fiddle playing. At one moment Almanzo was standing at the door, wearing the kilt and velvet jacket of a sword dancer. At the next he backed quietly away and disappeared into the night. Nobody noticed him though. He ran down the dark road, grateful he did not have to worry about bumping into the new owner of Castle Keep. At home he heard a crash, and spun around to see a pane of one of his windows had shattered. Through the window, over the dark water, he saw a blue flame flying like an arrow through the clear night, curving out until it touched the roof of Castle Keep, leaped up for an instant as if in triumph, and disappeared. Almanzo stood looking out. "Du bist attached, Boggart," he said. "Welcome home." In a gentle whirl of sooty dust, the Boggart dropped down the chimney and out into the broad living room hearth of Castle Keep. He breathed a long, happy sigh. Then he put himself through the gap under the door and flittered into the kitchen, which seemed warmer than he remembered, and twitched at the tail of a prowling mouse. The mouse squeaked indignantly, and the Boggart saw fragments of sandwich lying on the table near two small plates, as if two small people had left the remnants of a snack. He popped a piece into his mouth, and tasted peanut butter. He smiled. In the glow of the night lights he flittered happily around the castle, greeting every stone and board and corner, every room and door. Nothing had changed. It was all the same as before, though cleaner. He drifted into the Macbevons' bedroom, and found the wardrobe full of clothes that were not the Macbevons, but similar, and in the Macbevons' bed, a sleeping man he breathed with the same right kind of gentle snore. The Boggart came a welcome, and tied the new owner, Mr. McConaughey's shoelaces together to greet him in the morning. In the next room, to his delight, he found two small sleeping boys, of a perfect age for Boggart teasings, and he flittered busily about the house until he found a needle and thread. Then he came back and sewed neat little stitches across the ends of the sleeves of one boy's shirt and the legs of the other one's jeans. He would take care to be hovering, appreciative and invisible, when they woke up and began to dress. In a sheltered corner downstairs, he heard a sleeping dog whimper at his passing. The Boggart could hardly believe his luck. Here was another werewolf pup with whom he could have great fun. As a beginning, he caught a large, black beetle and dropped it in the White Rose water bowl. In the sleeping castle, the Boggart paused at one of the narrow outer windows that opened toward the island of Mull. Tomorrow he would visit the seals on the rocks out there. A picture flickered through his wild mind of a girl and a boy whom he had watched visiting the seals once, but he could not remember their names. He looked out at the glimmering sea and the islands, and the sky lit with stars that had seen all the great or terrible things that ever happened in Scotland, through more years even than the Boggart. Echoing faintly over the water from the village hall, he heard the joyful carol of a single bagpipe. He flittered away to the library, and found his own special place was still there, the space between two blocks of stone high in the library wall, where 300 years earlier an absent-minded mason had forgotten to put mortar, and an absent-minded carpenter had hidden the forgetfulness with a shell. The Boggart curled up, contented, at home, and went to sleep. Edited by the esteemed Dr. Professor Fred Weasley.